Well, joining me in the studio today is Emma Powell. She's a spokesperson for international relations for the Democratic Alliance. So, Emma, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
Well, that was quite a meeting yesterday in Washington between President Trump and President Ramaphosa, and John Steenhuisen from the DA was also there. So, if we look at what led up to it, can you give us a bit of clarity on that?
Well, I think it's clear that the relationship between South Africa and the United States has been deteriorating for some time. It certainly has, the pressures increased under President Donald Trump, as we knew that it would. But I think that we can trace its origins really back to um, Ambassador Ruben Brigatti's explosive Lady R allegations in May 2023, so 2 years ago, which was, of course, followed by a huge amount of noise in regards to South Africa's cozying up with the axis of malign actors, in particular Russia. And that was then followed by a number of legislative attempts to engender some form of accountability from South Africa out of Congress. And the most significant of those was, of course, the US South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act, which was a bill that was tabled before the House Foreign Affairs Committee by Reps James and Moskowitz. And what was most notable about that act, or bill at the time, is that it passed markup through the House Foreign Affairs Committee with bipartisan support. I think the numbers were, I stand to be corrected, but they were close to 36 in support to 13. Um, and these were the first in a litany of signals that the relationship was in distress and that South Africa's continued AGOA eligibility wasn't guaranteed. Now, moving to President Donald Trump, we know that his America First trade policy, which has been reinvigorated in recent months, explicitly links trade to national security. Now, of course, the African Growth and Opportunity Act mandates that countries who are beneficiaries of its preferential market access may not act in a manner that is contrary to national security interests of the United States, which of course means for South Africa that if we want to continue to enjoy that access, we may not engage, certainly not to the level that we have been so overtly, with America's strategic adversaries and continue to enjoy this access. Now, the reason, Linda, that this is so crucial for South Africa to understand is that when we talk about defining our foreign policy in the national interest, our national interest in South Africa right now needs to be singularly and laser focused on the creation of jobs and growing the economy. So, in the context of, I think we do about 156 billion rands worth of, or we export 156 billion rands worth of goods. 76 billion rands worth of these goods is exported under AGOA. We really can't afford to be messing around with the United States right now.
Well, President Ramaphosa said afterwards, at least they didn't disengage. So, where do you think we stand now with the diplomatic relationship between South Africa and Washington?
Well, I think last night's meeting was uncomfortable, but it was the first step in I hope, a series of ongoing engagements. And that meeting at the Oval Office really highlighted two things. On the one hand, on the positive side, it highlighted the unity of South Africans when under pressure. But at the same time, it highlighted some of the most pressing challenges that needed to be ventilated, that I certainly am deeply grateful to the United States for having put on the agenda in such a pointed manner. And I believe that it was really quite a win for South Africa, for the poorest people in South Africa, that President Donald Trump really got Ramaphosa to admit before the world stage that unemployment was a crisis, that it was indeed driving the barbaric levels of crime and criminality that we see in South Africa, and that something needed to be done. So I'm glad that President Ramaphosa went into that meeting acknowledging that denial was not going to be a strategy, and that some hard truths needed to be brought home. Now, whilst last night's meeting focused predominantly on the issue of the plight of Afrikaans or Afrikaner minorities in South Africa, and the very dangerous rhetoric of the economic freedom fighters and MK, um, as well as some of the issues regarding land, there have been a host of other challenges that have been highlighted by the 47th administration that weren't discussed publicly. And it's certainly my hope that after the media scrum that we all witnessed last night, where I think it could have gone in two directions, and we were able to sort of ensure that sort of a level of rationality in terms of open, mature dialogue prevailed instead of the meeting descending into the kind of chaos we saw with President Zelensky. I do hope that further to those conversations, um, there will be backroom discussions around other issues in to my mind, most importantly, South Africa's foreign policy positions. For example, long-standing issues that have been highlighted, such as Pretoria's unilateral downgrade of the Taiwanese liaison office in South Africa after sort of 27 years of having a memorandum of agreement that allowed them representation in Pretoria, which is indicative of, I believe, increasing pressure from China. The issue of South Africa's litigation against Israel at the International Court of Justice, despite the abhorrent plight of the poorest people in this country and the crime that we as South Africans navigate daily. Then, of course, the ANC's public support for sort of pro-BRICS de-dollarization, the ANC's equivocation on Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine, the ANC's deepening ties with the theocratic dictatorship of Iran, and then, of course, in the region, our country's failure to uphold democratic principles in places like Mozambique and Zimbabwe. So this continued uh, habit of the ANC to determine South Africa's foreign policy agenda on the basis of their liberation era allegiances aligning with their fraternal allies rather than prioritizing the country's strategic interests. So there's a lot still to discuss, Linda, but I think that the shots that have been fired across the bow so far by the US have certainly caught our government's attention. They know that Trump means business. And I think that we can only see positive developments coming out of this spotlight that is now being shone on South Africa.
Well, the foreign policy is the one area where the DA has felt that hasn't had enough of input. With John Steenhuisen, the DA leader yesterday there, do you think that the DA might now have a bigger say in foreign policy determination in South Africa?
Well, when the negotiations were ongoing, what was highlighted by the ANC was that under no circumstances were they going to allow any other party in this 10-party coalition near the justice, security, or foreign affairs portfolios. And one has to ask the question, why? So we have an ANC minister, we have two ANC deputy ministers, and we have an ANC portfolio committee chairperson. The statement of intent that was signed stipulated that no department would have what we would call a sealed mandate. So it was essentially decided that all decisions would be taken in cabinet on the basis of sufficient consensus, 60% plus, which would essentially mean the DA and the ANC agreeing. And to date, we have had absolutely no ability to have a rational, mature, sane conversation around redefining the national interest. And so whilst we're seeing cooperation in certain areas, and I think that the cooperation between our party leader, John Steenhuisen, and the president in demonstrating unity of purpose at the White House last night was important, on the domestic front, it is becoming increasingly urgent that we return to the negotiating table in really helping the ANC to understand that they no longer have an outright majority. They're a 39% party. and they no longer have the ability to determine South Africa's interests in the world without input from their partners in government. I certainly, as the national spokesperson, will continue to highlight the binaries. I will continue to speak with global leaders to represent the DA and our constituency on the global stage in demonstrating that the ANC's foreign policy positions don't represent the majority of South Africans. They're not in the national interests of South Africa. They are actively harming and undermining our economic growth prospects. And what we really need to do is realign our foreign policy agenda in a manner that uses our constitution as the foundational bedrock. Um, and I fear that so long as the ANC retains its stranglehold on this portfolio, that we'll continue to see increasing and overt alignment with nations whom we share so little in common. And then, Linda, of course, we need to talk about trade. I mean, if we look at our trade relationship with the United States of 156 billion rand, majority of it value-added manufactured goods exported to the United States every year. The European Union, the UK, the US being our three largest foreign direct investors. And then we compare it to trade that we do with, for example, Russia. I think that's about 5.4 billion rand. So 156 billion versus 5.4. Iran, the ANC seems to have this obsession with what I would classify as the snake of the head in terms of the destabilization in the Middle East. 350 million rand, not even a billion rand. So it just, if we look at the numbers, the maths, it doesn't add up. And there are very clear consequences. So we've seen that the US have cancelled all of their PEPFAR funding to South Africa. 8 billion rand was allocated for this year. Our government is unable to plug that gap. Yesterday in the budget speech, the finance minister admitted that there is no plan to plug that gap, and clinics are shuttering across South Africa. US aid programs have been suspended, things like money for assistance with illicit wildlife trafficking. We've seen punitive tariffs imposed. Very little has been done to try and negotiate a strategic investment framework as an on-ramp towards a formal bilateral trade deal. We know that AGOA is most likely dead in the water. And so at this moment in time, South Africa really needs to be doing absolutely everything it can to rebuild trust with our largest economic trade and investment partners. And the last thing I'll say, Linda, is just a caveat. We are a sovereign nation. I'm not for a minute suggesting that we become sort of the proxy of another state, or that we have to be DC shills, or, kowtow to foreign diktats from countries with bigger economies than ours. Not at all. What I'm saying is that we need to be pragmatic. We need to be laser focused on growing our economy and creating jobs. And right now, that means ensuring that we can rebuild trust with the United States, and finding out from them what that would look like and what that would require.
So, building trust for the US, who do you think the ambassador should be in Washington? Because that post is still vacant.
Well, it was quite telling to me that after Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool was demarched and expelled from the United States, President Ramaphosa, after a fairly lengthy period of silence, appointed Mr. Jonas, who's the chairperson of MTN, as his special envoy to the US. And of course, Mr. Jonas was missing in action in the Oval Office last night. I read Foreign Minister's spokesperson Crispin Perry said that Mr. Jonas was in fact in the Middle East. One wonders what he was doing in the Middle East at the moment of truth, given that he is South Africa's special envoy to the United States. So there doesn't seem to be any tangible action there. In terms of appointing an ambassador, we've been very clear that gone are the days that ANC cadres should be appointed as ambassadors. We need trained, skilled diplomats with experience in negotiations, who understand economic interests, are able to drive trade representation at our consulates, So I would suggest that it would be somebody from the private sector and somebody who has got skills, training, and professional expertise in diplomacy and negotiation. And I think that there are many well placed people in South Africa to do that job. It all comes down to political will. And of course, Mr. Ramaphosa doesn't do anything in a hurry. Last night, of course, President Ramaphosa relied quite heavily on pivoting to our party leader um, in moments of tension. And I think that Minister Steenhuisen did a very good job in highlighting the binary of the constitutionalists and the anti constitutionalist anarchist forces that seek to destroy South Africa. But more needs to be done. Last night was the first of one engagement, so we need a strong ambassador, a strong trade team, and we need to be really firing on all cylinders in terms of working with U.S. trade reps and our ministers' counterparts to understand where we can strike a mutually beneficial agreement in regards to trade. And then, of course, we need to be leading conversations around um, development aid, because I think that ultimately U.S. isolationism in that area is going to harm them in the long term. I understand there's an American first policy agenda at play, but in order to wield the soft power that the USA has done over the course of many decades, I think that in certainly in the African context, development aid is a crucial part of being able to wield soft power, especially in this competing um, or, or this competitive environment where we're seeing this great power competition reemerge. And of course, Africa is a fertile proxy territory in which these ideological battles can play out. So lots to discuss still, Linda.
Do you have a name that you'd like to put forward for the US ambassador?
Well, I think that as a politician, I would be intellectually dishonest if I said that I don't believe that diplomats should be linked to political parties and then to suggest who my preference would be. My preference as a politician is irrelevant. It needs to be, I think, a skilled, trained negotiator, business person, or diplomat. And it's certainly not my place to make recommendations in terms of names.
Emma Powell, thank you so much.